Mid-sized American city. Tuesday, 7th, 14 p.m. A woman stands frozen in the dark. The hum of the refrigerator is the only sound, but the silence is screaming. My name is Mckenzie Rivers, and I am holding the device that just delivered my execution order. The text message from my parents demands total distance, yet the banking alert flashing underneath it tells a darker story. They didn't just want to erase me from the family photo, they wanted to erase me on paper. Standing there in the dim light of my apartment, I realized I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was their mark, and the robbery had already begun. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The text message arrived at 7:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was standing in the middle of my kitchen, a half-rinsed coffee mug in one hand and my phone in the other, staring at the screen until the backlight timed out and went black. I tapped it again just to make sure I had read the words correctly, but they hadn't changed. The message was from a group chat titled Rivers Family, sent from my mother's number, but phrased with the collective authority of a court summons. "We need distance from you. Please stop contacting us completely." That was it. No explanation, no preamble. Just 14 words that felt less like a request and more like an amputation. I should have dropped the mug. I should have collapsed onto the linoleum or screamed or called them back in a panic. That's what people do in movies when their families cut them off. Instead, I stood perfectly still. I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe for a solid 10 seconds. I just went numb, a cold, clinical detachment washing over me as I observed the room around me. I noticed the hum of the refrigerator, a sound I usually ignored, but which now seemed deafening in the silence. I looked at the cheap white plastic blinds covering the window, one slat slightly bent from where I'd caught it in the sash last week. I looked at my thumb hovering over the reply button, trembling ever so slightly. It felt like an ambush, sudden and violent, yet deep down in the pit of my stomach, I realized this wasn't a surprise. It was just the final straw. It was the moment the invisible weight I'd been carrying my entire life finally crushed me. I'm Mckenzie Rivers. To the outside world, I'm a ghost, the quiet, dependable woman in the back office of the payroll department at the regional hospital. I'm the one who makes sure the checks go out on time, who catches the decimal point errors, who lives in a cramped but neat one-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city where the rent is reasonable. I drive a sedan with a dent in the rear bumper because I haven't had the extra cash to fix it in 3 years. My life is small. It's small because I gave the rest of it to them. For as long as I can remember, my existence has been defined by what I sacrificed for Daniel and Carol Rivers. I grew up in a working-class suburb where the concept of family first wasn't just a motto, it was a command. My parents were the salt-of-the-earth types, the kind who never missed a Sunday service, and were always first in line for the potluck, their casserole dishes held high like offerings. To the neighbors and the church ladies, my parents were saints who had worked hard all their lives. They believed in the American dream of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. They just never mentioned to anyone that for the last decade, I was the bootstrap. I was the oldest, the responsible one. My younger sister Haley was the baby, the fragile one who needed protection. While I was studying late to keep my scholarship or working double shifts to build a savings account, Haley was being coddled through crisis after crisis. She called me K-Bank when she thought I wasn't listening, a joke that stung more than I ever admitted. My parents called it helping out. They called it what any good daughter would do. I paid their rent when my dad's construction hours got cut. I covered the car note when my mom's hours at the diner dwindled. I paid for Haley's medical bills when she didn't have insurance. I had quietly, dutifully poured my own dreams into the foundation of their lives, cementing the cracks so the world wouldn't see them falling apart. I had sacrificed vacations, a down payment on a house, and a social life, all to keep the Rivers family afloat. And now, standing in my dim kitchen, I was being told that I was the problem. I was the one they needed distance from. The unfairness of it should have made me angry, but the numbness held firm. It felt like they were trying to erase me from the family tree to scrub away the person who knew their secrets and their debts. They wanted the slate clean, but they wanted it on their terms. My phone dinged again in my hand. I flinched, assuming it was a follow-up text, maybe an insult from Haley or a guilt trip from my mother. But the vibration pattern was different. It was a sharp, double buzz, a notification from my banking app. I unlocked the screen expecting a confirmation for a utility bill, or maybe a reminder about my low balance. Instead, a bright red banner flashed across the top: security alert, new inquiry. I frowned, my thumb tapping the notification. The app opened, requiring my Face ID, and then loaded a credit monitoring report. It showed a new hard inquiry on my credit report posted just minutes ago. A loan application for $5,000. I hadn't applied for a loan. I hadn't applied for anything. My heart, which had been so slow and heavy moments ago, suddenly kicked into a gallop against my ribs. This wasn't just someone using my debit card to buy gas. This was a formal application using my social security number. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the details of the application that had triggered the alert. It listed the applicant, Mckenzie Rivers. It listed my social. But when my eyes landed on the co-applicant address, the breath finally left my lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. The address listed wasn't my apartment. It was a small rental house on the edge of town. My parents' house. The phone felt heavy in my hand like a stone. The two notifications sat there on my screen side by side in a sickening juxtaposition. The text demanding I stay away, and the fraud alert showing they were using my name. The pieces snapped together with a terrifying clarity. They didn't cut me off because I had done something wrong. They cut me off because they were done with me. They didn't need Mckenzie the daughter anymore. They needed Mckenzie the credit score. In that moment, standing alone in the silence of my kitchen, I understood the true depth of the betrayal. My family didn't just want distance, they wanted to erase me on paper and keep my money. They wanted to ghost me while wearing my skin. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a daughter. I felt like a victim. To understand why a fraudulent loan notification didn't make me scream, you have to understand the house I grew up in. It wasn't a house of loud violence. It was a house of whispered desperation. I can still hear the sound of my parents' voices drifting through the thin drywall of my childhood bedroom late at night. They were always hushed, jagged whispers that sounded like paper tearing. My dad worked construction, his body breaking down a little more with every paycheck, and my mom picked up shifts at a local diner, coming home smelling of grease and exhaustion. Money wasn't just a tool to them, it was a ghost that haunted every hallway. From the time I was old enough to understand English, a single message was drilled into my skull: we sacrificed everything for you. It wasn't said with warmth. It was said as a debt collection notice. When other kids in our working-class suburb got grounded for bad grades or staying out late, I got the guilt trip. My mother would sit me down at the kitchen table, her eyes wet and accusing, and list the things they had gone without, so I could have shoes or a school field trip. Your existence is a blessing, she'd say, but it's a blessing that cost us everything. One day, Mckenzie, you'll understand, and one day you'll pay us back. Family loyalty was the weapon they used to silence any question I ever had. We went to church every Sunday, and whenever the sermon touched on honoring your father and mother, my dad would squeeze my shoulder, his heavy hand a physical reminder of the commandment. I learned early on that love was transactional. If I wanted their approval, I had to be an investment that yielded returns. Then there was Haley. My younger sister was the baby, the fragile ecosystem that had to be protected at all costs. While I was taught to be made of steel, Haley was treated like spun glass. She had anxiety, she dropped out of community college 3 times, and she cycled through unstable boyfriends who punched holes in walls. Every time Haley made a mess, my parents turned to me. "You're the strong one, Kenzie," they'd say. "Your sister isn't built like you. She can't handle this." If I hesitated to fix her problems, the threat was immediate and cold. "If you don't help family, don't bother coming for Thanksgiving." They knew exactly where to cut to make me bleed compliance. I remember the first time the dynamic shifted from emotional labor to hard currency. I was 22, freshly graduated, and working my first real job. I had visited home for a Sunday dinner, and as I was walking to my car to leave, my dad followed me out to the driveway. He looked smaller than I remembered, scuffing his work boots against the gravel, refusing to meet my eyes. "We're behind on the mortgage, Kenzie," he said, his voice rough. "Just this once. We sacrificed everything for you to get that degree. We just need a little help." I remember the swell of pride I felt in that moment. It was intoxicating. For the first time, I wasn't just a burden or an expense. I was the savior. I wrote the check right there on the hood of my car. I felt like I was finally good enough to be their daughter. I thought I was buying their respect. I didn't realize I was paying the admission fee for my own exploitation. "Just this once" became a lie almost immediately. One emergency morphed into a monthly subscription to their survival. It was car repairs in January, medical deductibles in March, Haley's apartment deposits in June, and overdue utilities by August. I started rearranging my entire life around their needs. I stopped taking vacations. I never built a savings account. I drove a beater car and lived in a cheap apartment because every spare dollar I earned was funneled into the black hole of my parents' finances. I had literally sacrificed my own future to sustain their present. When I tried to say no, my mother pulled out the heavy artillery. She used silence like a knife. She would ignore my calls for weeks, or she would cry huge heaving sobs that made me feel like a monster. "You're choosing money over your family," she would wail. "After all we did, family helps family, Mckenzie." She took the American values of community and support and twisted them into chains binding me to them. I thought about Mr. Lawson then. He was an old neighbor of ours, a man with a perfectly manicured lawn and a fence that he painted every spring. I used to chat with him over the railing when I was a teenager. Once, when I was complaining about my parents being overprotective, he had smiled sadly and said, "Good fences make good neighbors, Mckenzie, and they make good family too." I had laughed it off back then, thinking he was just talking about property lines. Now, standing in my apartment with that fraud alert burning on my phone screen, I realized he had been trying to warn me. I had never built a fence. I had let them graze on my life until there was nothing left. The realization hit me hard. This fraudulent loan wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was the logical endpoint of 30 years of conditioning. They had trained me to believe that my resources were theirs, that my name existed only to serve the family unit. The text message cutting me off and the loan application were two sides of the same coin. They were done asking. They were just taking. My hands were shaking not from cold, but from a sudden terrifying need to know the full scope of the damage. I closed the banking app and navigated to a credit monitoring site. I hadn't looked at my full credit report in years, mostly because I was afraid to see how high my debt-to-income ratio was from helping them. The screen loaded slowly, a spinning circle that felt like a countdown. When the report finally populated, I scrolled past my student loans and my own car payment. And then I stopped. It wasn't just one loan. There were 3 credit cards I had never opened. There was a utility account for an address I didn't live at. There was a buy now, pay later account for furniture I had never seen. The dates went back months, some even a year. I sat down on my kitchen floor, the cold linoleum seeping through my jeans. That's when I realized my parents hadn't just borrowed from me in a pinch. They hadn't just had a lapse in judgment. While I was eating instant noodles to save money to pay their electric bill, they had been systematically using my identity to fund a life they couldn't afford. They had been building a future where I was nothing but collateral. The drive to my parents' rental house took 40 minutes, and I spent every single second of it rehearsing. I turned the radio off so I could hear my own voice in the silence of the car. "Mom, Dad, I found accounts I didn't open. We need to fix this." I practiced keeping my tone even devoid of the accusation that was currently burning a hole in my chest. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, there was a misunderstanding. Maybe they had meant to ask. Maybe they were desperate. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, determined not to explode. I needed answers, not a fight. The house was a beige ranch in a faded subdivision where the lawns were starting to brown. I parked behind my dad's truck, took a deep breath that rattled in my lungs, and walked to the front door. I didn't knock. I still had a key, another symbol of my useful status. Inside, the scene was aggressively normal. The TV was blaring a game show at low volume, casting a flickering blue light across the living room. The smell of tuna casserole hung heavy and warm in the air. My parents were at the small dining table, plates half eaten, while Haley slouched in the corner chair, her face illuminated by the glow of her smartphone. Kenzie. My mom looked up, fork paused halfway to her mouth. We didn't know you were coming. There's plenty left if you want a plate. I didn't sit. I walked to the edge of the table and placed my phone down, screen up, showing the list of fraudulent accounts I had screenshotted in the car. I'm not hungry, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I found 5 loans and 3 credit cards in my name, Mom, all tied to this address. I didn't open them. I waited for the shock. I waited for the apology. I waited for them to look horrified that their daughter had been victimized. Instead, the room went still. But it wasn't the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a predator waiting to strike. My dad wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and leaned back, crossing his arms. We were going to tell you, he said, his tone casual, bordering on bored. We figured it was better this way. We thought you'd be grateful we didn't ask you directly and stress you out. I stared at him. Grateful you committed identity theft, Dad? Oh, stop with the legal mumbo-jumbo, my mother snapped, dropping her fork with a clatter. Her face twisted into a mask of instant martyrdom. After all we sacrificed for you, after everything we did to raise you, you're really going to come in here and nickel and dime your own parents? It's $5,000, Mom. That's not nickels and dimes. Haley snorted from the corner, not even looking up from her screen. You act like you're some victim, Kenzie. You're the one with the good job. You have benefits. You have a savings account. Stop acting like you're suffering. I felt the air leave the room. I had walked in expecting a confession, but I had walked into an ambush. They weren't sorry. They were offended that I had caught them. I didn't agree to this, I said, my voice rising. You forged my signature. You probably just forgot, my mom said, waving a hand dismissively. You've been so scattered lately, distant. People at church have noticed, you know. Sister Miller asked me just last week why you look so cold these days. You're making us look bad, Mckenzie. Is that what you want? To erase me as your mother in front of everyone because of a little money? I am not unwell, I said, focusing on keeping my hands from shaking. And I didn't forget. You stole my identity. We borrowed your credit, Dad yelled, his face suddenly reddening. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. Because this family needs to survive. But you don't care about that, do you? You're obsessed with money. You're selfish. The gaslighting was dizzying. They were rewriting reality in real time, painting me as the villain for objecting to being robbed. I looked at them. My father's anger, my mother's manipulative tears, Haley's sneering entitlement, and I realized they didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a resource. I'm disputing the loans, I said. It was a whisper, but it cut through the noise. I'm contacting the credit bureaus tomorrow. I'm removing my name from everything I didn't sign. And I'm stopping the automatic transfers for the bills. Haley jumped up her chair, screeching against the floor. Are you crazy? She screamed. If you stop paying, we'll lose the house. We'll end up in some dangerous neighborhood where I could get hurt. Is that what you want? You want me to get mugged? She was weaponizing fear, using her own fragility as a hostage to keep me in line. But something in me had snapped. The cable that had tethered me to their expectations for 30 years had finally frayed and broken. I feel like you've tried to erase me as a person, I said, looking directly at my mother. And keep only my paycheck. I'm done. "If you walk out that door," my dad threatened, standing up to loom over me. "Don't you come back. You're disrespecting this house." "I know," I said. I turned and walked out. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my legs were steady. I didn't look back at the window. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there in the dark, trembling. My phone buzzed. I looked down. A group text from Rivers' family. "We need distance from you. Please stop contacting us completely." I let out a harsh, dry laugh. They were firing me. I had quit, but they needed to be the ones to fire me to maintain the illusion of control. I put the car in reverse, ready to leave them and their debt behind. But then, my phone buzzed again. A second notification. It wasn't a text, it was an email. The subject line was flagged in red, "Urgent Payroll Inquiry." I tapped it open, my blood running cold. It was from the HR director at the hospital. "Mckenzie, we need to meet first thing tomorrow regarding a serious complaint about your financial conduct." I lowered the phone, the glow of the screen illuminating the horror on my face. That's when I realized they weren't just cutting me off. They knew I was fighting back, and they had launched a nuclear strike. They were about to threaten the one thing I had left: my job. The next morning, the air in the Human Resources office felt vacuum-sealed. I sat in a small glass-walled room that offered zero privacy from the passing glances of my colleagues, staring across a polished oak table at my HR representative, Linda, and my immediate supervisor, Greg. There was no small talk. There was no coffee. There was just a single file folder in front of Linda and a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. "Mckenzie." Linda began, her voice professional but icy. "We received a call this morning on the anonymous ethics line. It was from a concerned family member." I didn't flinch, but under the table my hands clenched into fists so tight my fingernails bit into my palms. I knew. I knew exactly who had made that call. "The caller alleged that you are in a state of severe financial instability." Linda continued, her eyes scanning a printed sheet in the folder. "More concerningly, they suggested that you might be using company payroll systems to divert funds or manipulate records to cover personal debts. Given your role in payroll, surely you understand we have to take this incredibly seriously." The room spun for a fraction of a second. It wasn't just a lash-out. It was a calculated strike at the foundation of my life. My parents knew my job was the only thing that gave me independence. They knew that in payroll, integrity is the only currency that matters. A rumor about financial impropriety is as fatal as a conviction. They weren't just mad, they were trying to starve me out. I forced myself to breathe. I forced the panic down into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. "I understand completely," I said, my voice startlingly calm. "However, I need you to know that the allegations are false. I am currently the victim of identity theft committed by the very family members who called you. I severed financial ties with them last night, and this is their retaliation." I laid it out for them: the unauthorized loans, the fraud alerts, the police report I intended to file. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I spoke with the precision of the accountant I was offering to open my personal bank statements and cooperate with any internal audit. "I have nothing to hide," I told them. "I am transparent. My resilience is my own, not something they can take." Greg and Linda exchanged a look. The tension in the room broke just a fracture. "We believe you, Mckenzie," Greg said, though his tone was cautious. "But this is a hospital. We have a fiduciary duty. We're going to have to review your activity logs. You need to get this handled. If this drama bleeds into the workplace again, our hands might be tied." They let me go back to my desk, but I felt the weight of the watch list on my back. I sat there staring at spreadsheets, feeling like a criminal in my own sanctuary. At lunch, I couldn't stomach the cafeteria, so I escaped to a coffee shop down the street. I was staring blankly into a latte when Jordan Blake slid into the booth across from me. Jordan worked in IT, a guy with messy hair and kind eyes, who had always been friendly, but today he looked concerned. "You look like you've been through a war," he said quietly. I intended to brush him off to give my usual "I'm fine" deflection. But the dam broke. I told him everything. I told him about the loans, the text message, the ambush at the dinner table, and the HR meeting. I spoke in a halting, embarrassed rush, ashamed that my life was so messy. Jordan didn't look at me with pity. As I spoke, his expression darkened into genuine fury. "That's not family," he said, his voice low and hard. "That's a syndicate. Mckenzie, you need a lawyer, a real one, a consumer rights attorney, and honestly, you probably need a therapist too. You can't carry this alone." He was right. That afternoon, I made 2 calls. The first was to a lawyer Jordan recommended. The second was to Dr. Elena Park. Sitting in Dr. Park's office 2 days later, surrounded by soft lighting and neutral art, I finally cracked. "I feel guilty." I confessed, wiping at my eyes with a tissue. "I feel like I'm betraying them. They're my parents. I'm thinking about legal action against the people who gave me life." Dr. Park looked at me over her glasses, her expression unreadable but gentle. "Mckenzie, you didn't abandon your family. They've been slowly erasing you. They erased your boundaries, your savings, and now they're trying to erase your reputation. Protecting yourself isn't betrayal, it's survival." Her words echoed in my head as I drove home, but the world outside wasn't letting up. My phone buzzed with notifications from Facebook. I saw vague, passive-aggressive posts from my aunts and cousins. So sad when ungrateful children forget where they came from. A message popped up from a friend I knew from the church choir. "Your mom called me. She was crying. She said you're going through a mental health crisis. We're praying you stop attacking your parents and come home." They were controlling the narrative. They were painting me as the unstable, cruel daughter before I could even open my mouth. But they forgot one thing: I was an accountant. I lived in a world of paper trails. That night, instead of hiding under my covers, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I stopped being the daughter and started being the auditor. I pulled every bank statement from the last 7 years. I downloaded every text message. I screenshotted the call logs. I organized everything into folders labeled by date and amount. My orderly mind, which they had used to manage their chaos, was now the weapon I would use to dismantle it. I remembered an old email address I had set up for my parents years ago, a shared family account for bills that I still had the password to because, of course, I was the one who managed it. I logged in hoping to find a receipt or a date I missed. I found something much worse. I clicked on a draft folder. There was an email thread between my mom and dad from 6 months ago. The subject line was simply credit. I opened it and the air left the room. "If we put the loan in her name, she won't notice until the statement comes," my father had written. "Just tell her it's for Haley's car if she asks," my mother had replied. "She's too soft to say no anyway. We have to use Mackenzie's credit without freaking her out. She's our retirement plan, Dan. We can't let her get wise too early." I sat in the dark, the blue light of the screen illuminating my face, reading my parents' plan in their own words, seeing the cold, calculated strategy behind the guilt trips. I felt something inside me change. The guilt Dr. Park had tried to soothe evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was their mark. And marks don't stay silent forever. The office of the consumer rights lawyer was nothing like the sleek, glass-walled corporate firms you see on television. It was a modest room in a converted brick building downtown, smelling faintly of old paper and lemon polish. I sat there with Jordan next to me, my hands folded tightly in my lap, as Mr. Henderson reviewed the stack of documents I had printed out. He was a gray-haired man, with kind eyes, but a sharp, terrifying competence. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at the papers like they were pieces of a puzzle he had solved 1,000 times before. "It's textbook identity theft, Ms. Rivers," he said, tapping the loan applications. "The fact that they share your last name doesn't make it legal. It just makes it harder to prosecute emotionally. But legally, this is fraud. Plain and simple." He outlined my options: file disputes with the credit bureaus, file a police report to substantiate those disputes, and potentially file a civil suit for damages. A police report? I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. You mean criminal charges? If the district attorney picks it up, yes, Mr. Henderson said. But without a police report, the banks will likely hold you liable for the debt. You have to decide who pays for this crime, the people who committed it, or you. Walking out of that office, I felt a wave of nausea. Filing a police report against my own parents felt like a violation of every natural law I had been raised to revere. It felt like treason. I spent an hour in Dr. Park's office that afternoon, pacing the length of her rug. I'm destroying them, I said, my voice trembling. If I do this, I'm the villain in their story forever. Dr. Park stopped me. Mckenzie, look at the evidence you brought me. They didn't just borrow money. They planned to use you. They strategized it. Protecting yourself isn't revenge. It's survival. You aren't loading the gun. You're just refusing to stand in front of the bullet anymore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the glow of my laptop screen, the only light in the apartment. I had the police report number sitting next to me on a sticky note. I had the dispute letters ready to mail. But I knew the war wouldn't be won in a courtroom. It would be won in the court of public opinion, the very place they had tried to shame me. I opened the Rivers family group chat. It had been silent since their distance text, a silence they probably thought was punishment. I added 3 new people to the chat: Aunt Sarah, Uncle Mike, and Cousin Beth, the relatives who had been most vocal on Facebook about ungrateful children. I didn't type a paragraph of emotional vomiting. I didn't scream in all caps. I drafted a single, precise message. To everyone here, I am writing this to clarify the situation regarding my distance from the family. Over the last week, I have discovered 5 unauthorized loans and 3 credit cards opened in my name using my social security number, all tied to Mom and Dad's address. This is in addition to the $42,000 I have voluntarily paid over the last 7 years for your rent cars and medical bills. I attached a PDF. It was a spreadsheet color-coded and itemized listing every single transfer, every bill paid, every emergency covered since I was 22. I have filed a police report for identity theft today, I continued. I am disputing these fraudulent charges. I will no longer be sacrificing my future to cover your choices. Please do not contact me unless it is through legal counsel. I hit send. For a full minute, nothing happened. The silence was heavy, pressurized. Then the phone erupted. The bubbles popped up so fast they overlapped. Carol. You ungrateful brat. How dare you? Daniel, you're airing our laundry to your aunt. You're dead to us. Haley, you're threatening us with jail. Are you insane? You're destroying your own family. Carol. Money is not more important than parents. You are sick. Haley sent a separate message. You're trying to erase me as your sister just so you can keep your precious credit score. They were scrambling, throwing every emotional grenade they had. They were counting on the fact that I would be too ashamed to show the ugly truth. But I wasn't ashamed anymore. I waited for a break in the text storm and then I played my ace. I uploaded the screenshots of the email thread I had found, the one where they discussed using Mckenzie's credit and calling me their retirement plan and a mark. This is you, I typed, in your own words. The group chat went dead silent. The gaslighting couldn't survive the oxygen of indisputable proof. They couldn't say I was imagining it when their own names were attached to the plot. The fallout began almost immediately, but not from them. My phone buzzed with a private message from Aunt Sarah, the one who had posted about ungrateful kids just yesterday. Mckenzie. I had no idea. They always told us you refused to help them. They said you were letting them starve. I'm so sorry. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Deacon Miller from our old church. He sounded shaken. Mckenzie, your mother has been saying some terrible things, but I'm hearing rumors about a police report. I just wanted to hear your side. I told him the truth, calmly, without tears. I heard the air go out of him. The wall of community support they had built around themselves was beginning to crack. Then the final confrontation came. My parents called. I shouldn't have answered, but I needed to hear it. I needed to know it was real. "You think you're smart?" my father screamed the moment I picked up. His voice was unrecognizable, distorted by a rage I had never heard before. "You think you can humiliate us? We'll cut you out of the will. You'll get nothing. You're dead to this family." "There is nothing to inherit, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but steady against his screaming. "You spent it all. You spent me." "You're a monster," my mother sobbed in the background, "ruining us publicly like this." "You already tried to erase me," I said. "I'm just making sure I survive the way you left me." I hung up. I blocked their numbers. I sat there shaking, waiting for the guilt to crush me. But it didn't come. Instead, my phone rang one more time. It was Mr. Henderson, the lawyer. "Mckenzie, I just got off the phone with the fraud department at the First Bank," he said. "They've reviewed the affidavit and the evidence. They've accepted the fraud claim. They are flagging the co-applicant accounts for investigation immediately." I closed my eyes, a tear finally leaking out. For the first time in my life, my parents were going to face consequences, and I had no idea how far they'd go when they realized they couldn't control me anymore. That brings us to the end of Mckenzie's battle to reclaim her identity. It serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the hardest boundaries to draw are the ones with the people who raised us. What would you have done if you discovered that email thread? Let us know down below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.